And welcome everybody once again to this is the last episode of our winter series, and our spring series is now up online. So if anybody's interested in continuing following us along with these webinars, visit our website at mndnr.gov/discover. Bring it to our website for a whole series of spring programs. We got 13 of them coming up this spring. Should be a lot of fun. So I think with just like to introduce, this is going to be a really cool one, reading the landscape. It's not something a lot of people think of, Brian, but it's a beautiful time of year. It's springtime, and to get out there and kind of try to figure out what's happening over the winter and what's happening in the landscape is kind of a fun thing to do when you're hiking around. So thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Benji. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here with everybody today to share a concept that I agree, Benji, is really cool, reading the landscape. And the whole premise is wherever you go, every landscape you see is a reflection of the things that impact it. And it's a mix of succession, disturbances, and growth factors. So that's what we're going to talk about for reading the landscape today. And we'll talk about some of those concepts and then show some photo examples of different things. And just to preface it, we will just be scratching the surface today with this class. There'll be way more that you could find and explore, but hopefully through this class, it gets your wheels spinning, and just the concept of really being observant and aware of what's around you, and just pausing, slowing down and thinking, well, why is that like the way it is? What caused that to be growing there, or to have been deposited there, or to be like that? So that's what we're going to be looking at. And I'm Brian Wood. I'm Executive Director at Osprey Wild's Environmental Learning Center in Sandstone. So with that, we will talk more about the concept of reading the landscapes, and landscapes being reflections. And this is a concept that applies not only to Minnesota, but anywhere you go on the planet, wherever you're at, that landscape has reasons for it on why it looks the way it does. And it's dynamic, and it's responsive to the conditions that are coming with the growing conditions, the growing factors, what different succession is at play, what disturbances are impacting it. And so it's always dynamic and responding to those forces upon the landscape. And so for reading the landscape, we really get to be detectives and go out and notice the clues. And nature is great in that it leaves clues all around us for us to be able to look at and figure out. And then it's about really peeling back the layers of the onion to figure out, well, why is this the way it is? And what caused that? And going backwards in time as well as going forwards in time, and projecting maybe what might this look like if things keep playing out this way into the future. So everything you're looking at, no matter if you're in your yard or a city park or state park or anywhere, there are clues all around you. And so the idea is for you to be observing what those clues are and attempting to answer those questions. And if you start paying attention, you're going to start noticing clues. You're going to start noticing components to a greater story that will give you context of the area that you're in. And the big pieces at play really are succession and disturbance. And these two things are always competing with each other, or impacting a landscape. And sometimes one of them is more dominant than the other, and then another one's more dominant. And depending on which of those is the dominant factor at that time, you're going to see the landscape responding differently. If succession really dominates an area, then you're going to move towards a predictable climax ecosystem, which will get to a point where it's basically self-perpetuating, and it's not really going to change until some kind of disturbance comes along and resets that ecological clock. If you have disturbance that's really dominating, then you keep essentially erasing the blackboard very often, and nothing ever really gets established for a long term. And so you have a lot of stuff that do well early on, but might not necessarily get that chance to play out the full life cycle. And if either one of these things is really dominant, you're going to lose biodiversity, because if succession is dominant, you're going to end up with a pretty stale, shade tolerant, biologically not diverse area. And if disturbance dominates, you're resetting the clock so often that you're going to just have those really early pioneer species that tend to dominate. And so you won't have very diverse mix either. So when you have both of these things at play, then you have the patchwork and the mosaic and rich biodiversity on a given landscape. So the concept of disturbance can be natural or it can be human caused. And wherever you're going, there are probably some signs of disturbance. So if we think about natural disturbances, this is not an all-encompassing list, but this is one that you might come across, while you're outside in Minnesota. So temperature extremes can be a natural disturbance. Minnesota has a 174-degree swing. Our highest recorded temps 114. Our lowest is -60 for a state that's not mountainous. That is a huge range. And not everything can tolerate those temps. So you can get heat stress for certain species that just will not handle that. And so they might die off. You can also have cold temperatures that are going to cause frost cracks and splitting trees open and causing disease in those trees to die. So just temperature by itself is a disturbance. You can also have wind storms, flooding that can wash things out or cover roots and create wet conditions where they're not getting enough oxygen from the soil. So they might die that way or just get knocked over. Drought definitely is a disturbance, and every plant has different drought tolerance. And sometimes if it's too dry, things aren't going to make it. You can have ice storms where it's rain, freezing rain, and then turning to ice and building up and shattering branches. But you can also have, ice coming down a river and taking out trees along a riverbank, or ice forming in little pools around a tree that might split the tree. Lightning can hit a tree and split that open. Forest fires, prairie fires, those can be naturally occurring and reset the ecological clock. Grazing and browsing. So grazing really is when ungulates and animals are munching on fleshy green herbaceous stuff. That's what you would consider grazing. So that's going to be during the growing season. And browsing is, they're forced to munch on woody stuff when all that stuff dies away in the fall, and going after woody shrubs and the twigs on shrubs and trees. So those are disturbances that definitely impact plants. There's one animal that gets its own bullet point, and that's beavers, because they have such a large impact on an ecosystem. And we'll show some highlights of that. Then we also have pathogens, so naturally occurring insects and diseases that come through and might wipe out an individual plant or a community. So those are, again, some natural disturbances, not all encompassing, but gives you an idea of some of those that you could see evidence of when you're outside. If we think about human disturbances, this isn't a be-all, end-all, but a lot of things that we as people do can impact a landscape. So agriculture is a big one, and within that, there's a lot more to get into than just the concept of agriculture. But plowing, clearing fields, grazing, those kinds of things have a lot of impact. Logging, development into other uses, human-caused fires, whether that's intentional or unintentional, that has the same consequence of fire moving through a landscape. But alternatively, fire suppression is also a human disturbance, where we might actually keep fires naturally occurring from spreading and creating those newer plant communities. So fire suppression can actually be a human disturbance. Draining wetlands for more agriculture or development, mining, different invasive and exotic species that we've brought over from various places that have now taken a foothold and might really impact the plant communities. Abandonment, which could be from agriculture abandonment or beaver abandonment from a pond or a dam. And different reasons for moving water to other places, which might cause places to be drier, wetter, diseases that we might bring in and take off. like Dutch elm disease, insecticide, herbicide applications, pollution, habitat loss, climate change, and then just the evidence of humans moving around, whether they're walking or biking or whatever, and you might have soil compaction or stuff not growing. So with those disturbances, some of them could be on a very minute scale, and others could be a much larger thing. For example, climate change, where you're not going to necessarily look at one plant, but if you're looking at an ecosystem level, you might see changes on a large scale of where biomes are moving. So these are human disturbance examples. Succession is really the predictable march of vegetation over time. So if you're going from the very basic part of succession, you're talking about no soil, you're talking about bare rock, and what starts from there, and that's lichens. And lichens are very hardy little symbiotic plants of algae and fungus that can take foot on rocks and start putting in roots and creating cracks and making soil. And as those break down, they create soil for shade intolerant grasses, annuals to move in, and then perennials. And as those things keep getting established, growing more soil, you get more shade tolerant plants moving in, larger because there's more soil for bigger roots. And then you can get up to trees from shade intolerant to shade tolerant. So if disturbance never is at play, there's a pretty predictable progression in terms of plants for succession. And this is a concept of that, going from bare rock up to lichens and mosses. That's really the beginning. And here in Minnesota, because of our past geologic history, we still see this, what's called primary succession, playing out with lichens and mosses establishing. And then you get those annual herbs and grasses and forbs and shrubs, and keep predictably moving up into forests. So that's primary succession, when you have just bare rock and lichens and mosses are getting established and it's moving like that. But you also have concepts where you're not going all the way back to bare rock, but you're going back pretty far and back to where pretty much all the plants are killed on the surface. And that's what you'd call secondary succession. So if you have a fire that moves through, burns everything down, you're starting with intact soil profiles and seed banks probably in the soil. But you're starting with that exposure of the bare soil. That's different than primary succession, where it's just bare rock. So ways that you get back to this might be flooding, might be fire, might be tilling from an agricultural standpoint, where all the roots are ripped up from the past year. And then you have pretty much the same predictable march again. You might not get the lichens and mosses because there's already soil, but you're going to move into those shade intolerant annual grasses and herbs, and then perennial herbaceous plants, shrubs, and trees. So you get there, it's just you're not going as far back on the succession scale. We also think about growth factors. So succession, disturbance, and then growth factors. And what impacts where stuff grows has really to do with the substrate. So we're getting down to the parent material. What's our bedrock? That's going to tell us a story also of how that bedrock formed. For Minnesota, we have glacial history that plays out and has a really big impact on what the surface looks like for us, as well as what the soil's like. Because depending on what glacial features came through a given area, you might have very, very clay-rich soil. You might have silt, you might have gravel, sand, and that all really is based on what the glacial history was for an area. So that makes it really interesting for Minnesota to look at the green landscape through that. But those things are going to play into what your substrate is and what can grow. From there, your climate, your temperature, your precipitation, the swings, the ranges, the amount of precip, when that precip falls, those all play into what kind of biome you're going to have, what kind of plant communities. And then on a more individualized scale for plants, you're going to look at the exposure. So is there a lot of wind exposure to an area? You know, if you're up on a high exposed hill, you're going to have different plants growing there than down in a low valley, because that's going to influence the desiccation, you know, sun exposure, the soil drying out. And so that exposure really plays in to what can grow. And you can just go a few hundred feet and find totally different plants based on that exposure. And same with topography, you know, what your altitude is. You know, for every 1,000 feet up you go in elevation, on average, you drop 5 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you've got Minnesota, where you've got 2,300 feet elevation at Eagle Mountain and 600 feet elevation at Lake Superior, that's 1,700 feet. So you might have 7-degree temperature difference from there down to the lake, and you might have different plants growing there. Or over in the Rockies, where you might have 14,000 foot peaks, you're going to have different plants growing there than at the 5,000 foot level. The direction of slope. So are you facing north? If you're facing north in the northern hemisphere, you're never getting direct sun exposure. So that means you're going to have less drying out. Stuff's going to stay more moist, damp, cooler, and that's going to lend itself to plants that like cooler, wetter areas. So you might get more shade tolerant things, more mosses, more, you know, as you go north, maybe more spruces. And as you go south, maybe more sugar maples or hemlocks. And then the steepness of the slope too. If it's really steep, that's going to drain fast and it's going to dry out. Even if, you know, your precip is the same amount from a flat area and a steep area, you're not going to be able to absorb as much on that steep area. So the amount that's available for plants is going to be different, and you're going to have different plants growing there. So those are some things that influence what's around you. And no matter where you go, not just Minnesota, all of those things are things you can keep in your mind or in your back pocket as, okay, some combination of these factors is at play. And if I start thinking about those, I can probably start figuring out why things are here, or predict maybe what might be here. So reading the landscape really is, you know, something to slow down. It's not about putting in lots of miles. It's about really being present where you're at and observing and noticing. And for how fast-paced life is now, it can be a nice reason to slow down and to notice things around you. And you look for patterns, you know, what seems to be the dominant pattern here, and maybe what are some outliers that kind of stick out that seem, I wonder why that's there. Why, what caused that? What might be the possibilities? Human disturbance, natural disturbance, growth factors. And it just gets your mind going. And you get to be curious, and you get to be a detective and feel like you're discovering stuff. And you might not have all the answers, and that's okay. But it's the process of just going in with that aware mindset where you're going to start noticing more things, and you might just start asking why more often. And when you start asking why, that's going to lead you down different paths. And depending on how much time and interest you have, you might go very far down a path to really figure out where you're at. And there are resources out there that you could use to help figure things out too. So if you're really wondering, well, what else could I find locally or that might help me? You know, go to your local historical museum at the county level, see if they've got photos of whatever area you're interested in, or go to your local library for the local history section. County plat maps, those are going to give you good views of topographic features and, you know, bodies of water. If you go to your soil and water district office, you could ask for quaternary maps, which is the last 2.5 million years of geologic time. And for us in Minnesota, that's going to mean any glacial features, any glacial impacts that have happened are going to show up on that quaternary map, which is really helpful to notice what the landscape is around you. Google Earth is a great feature too. And if you're at bodies of water, you could check out the Minnesota's DNR Lake Finder also. So it's really about just going, what happened here? And these are some great resources that can really help you in thinking about what should I be noticing or what can fill in the gaps of the story for me. So Vincent Brown's book, May Watt's book, and then Tom Wessel's has a few really good books out there. So if this gets intriguing for you, I definitely encourage you to go rent those from your local library or purchase them. And then before we get into some photos, I'll just say that if this program seems interesting to you, we do a whole bunch of weekend classes like this that are adult learning weekends that you can check out. We also have summer camps, K-12 overnight programs, community events like Maple Syrup Day. So check those out. We also have free trails for hiking and skiing. Last week we did. No more skiing now, really, but our trails are open to the public, and we're just an hour and a half north of the Twin Cities, hour south of Duluth. So come check us out. We're a nonprofit environmental learning center, and we'd love to see you out there. So with that, we'll get into some actual examples of what I'm talking about here. And again, we're just going to be scratching the surface, but hopefully it'll get you thinking about things you could notice. So near Sandstone, near Osprey Wilds, we have the beautiful Kettle River that flows through here. And the Kettle River cuts through sandstone. And so that gets to, this is the substrate of the area. If we're starting from the ground up, literally, it's sandstone. Well, where did that sandstone come from? Now you start peeling back the layers of the onion. That sandstone is there because of another rock feature before it, and that would be the mid-continental rift that opened up 1.1 billion years ago. All of that shaded area is filled in with basalt, that volcanic rock that went to the surface, cooled, and is buried under hundreds of feet of glacial sediment, or it's at the bottom of Lake Superior along the North Shore. But that created a big cavity that allowed for the erosion of rock to go in there, and those little granules of rock, quartz mostly, that filled in and then hardened on top of that basalt. And we have evidence of the wave action of that basin. So those granules of quartz filling in and having water lapping on them from the big depression of the rift, and eventually hardening and getting compressed and heated and cooked into sandstone. So that's evidence of waves from 800 million years ago. And as we look near that river, we have this really big hole. And this is another look at it without snow. So that is something caused by a lot of water moving through. Well, what could have caused that? Because the water right now isn't big enough to move through there and carve it out. So here we have evidence of the glacial impact of the drainage of Glacial Lake Duluth, rushing through, draining tons of water, very strong force. And you would get these rocks that would be getting into little grooves, little holes, and be a little bit harder than the parent material. And they get whirled around and whirled around and whirled around. And all that force of water coming through keeps scraping it down and creating these potholes. And these are littered along the Kettle River in Banning, as well as Interstate State Park. And that's tying back initially to the basalt from the Mid-Continental Rift, then to the sandstone getting deposited, then fast forwarding to the Ice Age and the glaciers building up, the ice melting and sitting in the basin of Glacial Lake Duluth, which was there because of the rift, making a depression, and then the climate warming and draining, and all that water rushing through and creating these. And here's one that's filled in with a red pine, but you could see that carved out from back when that water was much higher. And we're here at Osprey Wilds, and we have a big rock here. So we were talking about bedrock before with sandstone, but this is not bedrock. This is pink granite. Well, how does pink granite wind up at the surface? Again, that brings us back to glaciers. You know, we were 9 degrees cooler Fahrenheit annually when the Ice Age moved through. So it's not a crazy amount cooler, but it was enough that the winter snows didn't melt, and that snow got piled on from the next year and compressed into firn and then to ice, and then that starts spreading out like pancake batter and moving through and just picking up everything in its way, taking it along And then when it got to a point where it melted, it would drop whatever was in there like a conveyor belt. And like this giant glacial erratic, this big pink granite boulder that came from much farther north. And there's, its own story there of this is a rock that formed underneath the Earth's surface. This is the same rock, the same age that's a mile low at the Grand Canyon that is here at the surface in Minnesota. So fascinating story about how that uplifted, got to the surface, got plucked and carried down, and has been at the surface for the last 10,000 years for students to see. And we have primary succession playing out right now, where we have lichens moving across, growing on bare rock, just like would have been when life started hundreds of millions of years ago. And that process is still playing out now. So that's really cool. And depending on how pervasive those lichens are, you can measure the radial distance on those patches of lichen to give you an idea of how long those have been growing. This is another glacial feature that you might be able to see. It kind of goes up on one side, down on another, and it runs highest right here. So this is an above ground river that was deposited again from the glaciers. So this is Pine County. And if you see my arrow, hopefully you can see it. It's going from northeast to southwest and right through the middle here. This is an esker, and that picture I just showed you was right here. An esker is a spot where a glacier has a melting crack. The water starts flowing through the glacier. It hits the ground under the glacier, but that ground is frozen, and that all that little particulate matter, the sand, the gravel, has nowhere to go. So it hits the ground and it just gets deposited, and the water carves its own tunnel out of the glacier and starts melting and flowing out, and that substrate gets deposited on the ground, and the glacier melts away and leaves this riverbed that's on top of the ground. And these eskers are all across Minnesota, and a feature of the last ice age. Another feature are all the wetlands and ponds that we have. For us to have wetlands, they're either going to have spring fed, where there's a crack in the ground and it's bubbling up, or there's going to be a depression that holds the water. And a lot of times those depressions are from small chunks of ice that broke off, got pushed down into the ground, created a depression and the conditions for it to hold water. So those are all over Minnesota, and definitely a big part of that is because of our glacial history. Anytime you come to a stream, you can definitely admire the beauty, but you can also be thinking, what is the source of this stream? Where is it coming from? And tracing that source back. So that's a really good thing you can do with Google Earth. You can get on there and follow it back to see, is this from another river feeding in? Is it from a lake? Is it from a spring? Is it, it's going to have some answer to where it's coming from and why. And every river, every stream flows downhill. So that can tell you which, where the topography is. And from there you can follow, well, where does this stream go? What's its story? Where does it keep marching out to? For us at Osprey Wilds, this creek dumps into Grindstone Lake. And that's my dog Nellie there. But you can see also, it's not just the creek ending, it's a new formation happening. We have sand that's deposited. So that sand was being carried by the creek. And the size of the particles carried in water is directly related to how fast that water is moving. And so those sand particles can be suspended in the water as long as it's moving fast. But when it runs into a barrier, i.e. this lake where there's water already there and it can't keep flowing, it's going to hit that water, and all of a sudden now that sand drops and you get a delta. You get this outwash of sand, and you can see how it, hopefully you can see in the water, it spreads out quite far past where the water is. But that's because of the sand being carried down through the creek and deposited here. And if we think we want to go peel the layers of the onion back, you think, well, what is the sand made of? The sand is made of quartz, where did that erode from? And if you go back to the creek, you can see different spots of sizes of particles from sand. Silt is the finest, but you can go to sand and then gravel and then larger rocks and boulders. Those are going to be from slowest to fastest moving water. Here we have Grindstone Lake, which we might just assume lakes are all over the place, but for most of the world, lakes are a very rare occurrence. You really get lakes where you have glacial history of things being scoured out, or kettle lakes being formed by blocks of ice, or you have rift areas where the plates are pulling apart on the planet, and that creates a depression, like the African Rift Lakes or Lake Baikal. But otherwise, you really need to have had glaciers coming through. So the fact that we have lakes is, fascinating in and of itself, and then learning the feature of why that lake formed or how it formed is really interesting. But this photo here also, you can see how stuff is uplifted a couple of feet here from the rocks. And that's an example of the spring melts and the ice breaking up and predominant winds going from west to east. So from the right side of my screen to the left, jamming those big ice ramparts up, pushing the soil back, pushing up rocks. And you can see this uplifted here. And if we were on the other side of the lake, we really wouldn't see that because, the predominant winds are going west to east. But we see that. So that's evidence of a lake being in a place with ice. If it was a lake where you didn't get ice flows, like Okeechobee down in Florida, you wouldn't get this pushed up component along the shoreline. Secondary succession can be playing out through fire like this, or it could be played out through this, like tilling the soil and creating the conditions for stuff that wants to grow with bare soil. So one of the things that you might find in woodlands or areas around you is evidence of lots of agricultural work. So we have a rock wall here, and it's not just a rock wall, but that rock wall tells us a lot about the landscape. So people clear forests for agriculture for really three purposes. You're going to clear it for pasture to graze animals, you're going to clear it for a hay field, or you're going to clear it for row crops. So if you're clearing it for pasture, you might not need to remove any rocks. You just get the stumps out of the way and let grasses start growing. So you might find rocks interspersed out in the pasture because the glaciers moving through deposited a whole bunch of them. But if you're doing a hayfield or row crops, you need to clear that land. You need to be able to put a plow through it, and you need to get those rocks out of the way so you're not busting your machinery. So the size of the rock will indicate, what feature was happening. If you're doing a hayfield, you need to clear that out. You need to remove the rocks and plow it. And then once you get that seeded in, you don't need to keep seeding it every summer. So you might have only done 1 or 2 years where you're removing rocks, and those are the big ones at the surface. And after that, that hayfield just keeps growing and replenishing. But if you're doing row crops, then you are constantly picking out rocks every year because we have frost wedging. So water, when it goes to ice, it takes up 9% more space. So it has to expand, it pushes. And when you remove the intact roots, those roots would act like a fabric holding rocks in place in the soil. But when we break up that soil profile, we break up those roots. Now there's nothing keeping those rocks from going up to the surface through that frost action and popping up. And every spring, if you're tilling soil, you're going to end up with more rocks just marching their way up. And so you got to pluck those rocks. So when you have small rock piles, that's an indication that you've got row crop history, as opposed to just big rocks, which might be hay fields. And if those rocks have lots of lichens on them, that's giving you an indication that these rocks have been exposed for a really long time, several decades. And for agricultural areas, these rock walls are pretty pervasive. Some people might have done the walls, some might have put it around corners and stacked it within metal fencing. And with the US, barbed wire was invented in 1874. So most of our livestock operations used fence posts and barbed wire. But out in England, when have livestock much longer than that, or in New England, rock walls were actually built, straight enough and tall enough to hold livestock in. So with that, if you are working the land regularly, this wants to be forest based on our climate and our growing factors. But if we are not tilling it or burning it regularly, succession is going to start moving through. And you can see these tops of goldenrod. We have some baby white pines popping up. That's telling me that we haven't had any disturbance for at least a few years, because those pines are being allowed to get established. And if we just let that go, if we don't have tilling, if we don't have fire, we're going to start seeing succession playing out more. And here's an example of what that might look like if you sped forward years. Old crop field, and you have stuff that moved in that's shade intolerant. So it would have been goldenrod and grasses and Queen Anne's lace and blackberries, raspberries, strawberries, plantain. Those will be the first things getting established. And then you'll start getting birches and white pines and aspens getting going. And those are the shade intolerant trees that really like to get full sun. And as these get established and produce shade, now you're going to start getting shade tolerant things coming up underneath. And so if we came back in another 50 years, what we'd probably see coming up underneath these pines and aspens and birches might be maples instead of aspen and birch. Here we have a little straight stream. Nature doesn't really like straight things. Tend to not find lines in nature. You tend to find things meandering or round. So it makes us think, well, why is that straight? And you can see there's pretty uniform sized rocks along every side. The water's flowing. This is late fall. What could be, why would there be something straight? So if we follow that back, what we would find is some evidence of what the past use was. So that's what this was. This is a drainage canal. And we'll find evidence of that all throughout Minnesota, where we've removed wetlands, moved water where we didn't want it, and allowed more arable land to get established. But with this one, the tile has busted over the years, and now water isn't going just straight through the clay tile. Now it's coming out. Another agricultural piece is looking at a fence. A fence is not just a fence. A fence can tell you quite a bit about what kinds of animals might be there and where the animals might be. So with these fence posts, you want to look at the kind of wire. So if it's barbed wire, that would be for cattle or horses. But if you're seeing woven wire, that's going to indicate that they also probably had sheep. Sheep with their really thick wool, they're not going to feel the barbs, so they might press on it harder, and then they might get poked by that. And so you don't want them getting stuck in the barbs or hurting themselves. So woven wire gives you the option for both cattle, horses, and sheep, but it's more expensive because there's more strands to it. And then the side that it's attached is going to tell you which side the animals are on, because you want the staples on the inside. If the animals are leaning on it, you don't want the fence ripped away. You want them pushing in on it. And the kinds of posts that are used for that also can tell a story. So you want rot resistant posts. And in Minnesota, you're talking about tamaracks. Those are really good rot resistant posts that could hold up 100 years, or black locust. So if you don't have treated wood, the old time fence posts would have been those really naturally rot resistant ones. I'll just do a few more slides, and I know we're running out of time, but we'll open up for questions. Beavers play a big part of the landscape, and they really like to be able to flood an area to get at their food source by staying in water, which they're safer in water than they are out of it. And it makes it easier for them to get at those spots and not be sought out as prey. So this is an area in Osprey Wilds where right up kind of in the middle, you can see a very long dam. That dam's built by the beavers, floods an area. Now they have access to the kinds of foods that they want, which is willows, birches, aspens, all these conifers. Those are going to turn into dead snags because they have no interest in those. So those will just stay there. They're dying because they're totally submerged, and they will be there for a long time. Here's an example of a beaver dam that's been here a long time. So you don't actually see the mud and the sticks. Now it's got cattails growing all along it. And there's the lodge. And if you can see, there's light colored sticks. That's indicating chews from this year. So that's an active lodge out there. And there's the cache off to the side. So they're piling up their food store for the winter and being able to swim out from under, grab something to eat, swim back. And what they've done, if you can see this, man, that's a large area they impact. And that is the remnant of a forest. The only spot where you don't see tree stumps is right through the middle. So if you go back in time, that forest was right up to the creek. And when you find a dam, that's telling you you have moving water. It's not a lake, because a lake is not going to be moving water. They're damming a creek, a river to backflow that, to flood an area, to make it accessible for them. And so this really sets back the stage ecologically a long ways. And for decades, you're going to see evidence of those beavers. Eventually, those beavers will die or move on. And when they are not keeping that dam intact, it's going to start dropping water immediately. It'll start dropping up to a foot a week until it's all back to its normal hydrological state. And when that happens, after a while, then you get what's called a beaver meadow. And that means that the water is back to its normal size, but everything was flooded. You're at secondary succession again, and you're going to have those shade intolerant plants coming in, grasses, cattails, blackberries, raspberries starting, and it's going to take a long time, but slowly that'll creep back from the outside in and getting established. And then maybe in 40, 50 years, that forest will be ready for more beavers to move through, and their food source will be ready for them to eat. So I'm going to pause there. I have a lot more slides that, and like I said, there's always more to talk about, but hopefully it gives you an idea of some of the concepts of what reading the landscape's all about, and happy to field questions. And depending on the question, I might have a slide to pull up with you to show.
Yes, so if you have any questions, Brian, thank you so much for your knowledge and sharing your passion for landscape there. Really appreciate that. If anybody does have any questions, please put those in the Q&A section there, and we'll try to get to them. I think we're kind of in a super cool area too, Brian. You know, growing up in southern Minnesota, and I've lived in a few different places out west and whatnot across the states, and coming back to Minnesota and realizing, you know, some of the history that has come on, and from the southern Minnesota and the valleys and trout streams we have down there to the prairies and the farm fields and the logging up north and stuff. And Osprey's kind of in a cool little spot where kind of a lot of that stuff combines right there. So it's really a neat piece of property you guys have to walk around and learn some of this stuff and see it in person.
Yeah, it is a really cool learning environment, just from all the different things at play. And having the agricultural history gives a lot of fun things to explore and show students and get them aware of. You know, it can look very wild and remote and like a wilderness to some people, you know, stepping on the landscape, but you start looking at those clues, it shows there's a lot of evidence of past impact, past disturbance. Doesn't make any less beautiful. It just makes it interesting, I think.
Yeah, very cool. So Glenn has a few questions in here, and some of them are more on the geological side. But I know one of them was, is there a belt from Lake Superior that has an abundance of agates we can look for? And I know a common friend of ours, Craig Prudhomme, is going to actually be here in the spring to talk about agate hunting in Minnesota. But I don't know if you wanted to touch on that a little bit too.
It's a good question. Yeah, Lake Superior agates are state gemstone. A lot of people head up to the North Shore to look for agates. The agates were formed in that basin of the basalt, but as the glaciers came through, they really scoured it, broke it away from the basalt, and that got deposited as Glacial Lake Duluth, melted and had that outflow. So the best spots to find agates are actually south of Lake Superior, where stuff was draining and getting deposited. Barnum, Moose Lake, Willow River, those areas have gravel outwash spots those are the spots to look for agates. And if you just want to get out and pull off on a county road and walk the shoulder, you're going to find agates there. So that would be a much better spot to go agate hunting, would just be walking the not busy county roads around Pine County and Carlton County, because all that outwash from Glacial Lake Duluth, that's where those agates got deposited.
Yeah, everybody thinks of driving to the North Shore to find agates, and I don't think I found as many agates there as I have other places in Minnesota. So it's cool. So yeah, Glenn, if you're interested, again, our spring program just released, so mndnr.gov/discover, our website, you can sign up for those programs this spring. So Doug was saying just more slides. He loves the slides and the stories behind them. Barry was asking, can you say where that long esker was again?
Yeah, that esker is in Pine County. It is just south of Finlayson. And it's along, there's Highway 18 that runs west to east through Finlayson. And there's a road just west of town that heads south. And that's where it intersects. So you can see it from both sides of the road there. It's by Fish Lake.
Oh, yeah. Julie is wondering if you could explain how you can tell the primary succession from secondary succession.
Sure. Primary succession is when it's starting on bare rock. So if you have no soil at all, that is primary succession, and that's going to be lichens and mosses. Secondary succession would be you have a forest fire that moves through and burns everything down to the ground, or you have an agricultural field that you're tilling the soil, or something's being developed for a housing complex or something where they've knocked down the trees and removed all the stumps, and it's the ground is prepped for something. That would be secondary succession, where there's still soil. Primary succession is where it's just rock.
Great. Mary is wondering, are caves made the same way as a pothole is?
It depends. A lot of times caves are formed in limestone areas, and limestone is very easy to wear away because of the calcium content. It's pretty susceptible to the acid that's in the rainwater. So when rain falls, there's a little bit of acid in that water, and that eats through the calcium carbonate of the limestone, and that's going to make its way through the rock and create holes and caves. And that's most of the world's big caves are limestone, where it's really the groundwater that's eating through that as it's draining down into the river. Caves, not as often are you going to find the majority of the caves from a glacial river that's drained through and carved it out. Could be, but the majority of them are going to be from those karst topographies. So southeast Minnesota, where it's limestone because we used to have an inland ocean there 300 million years ago, that's going to have a lot of caves just from that acidic water eating through the limestone and creating openings.
If you've ever been down in southeast Minnesota, some of those caves like Niagara and Mystery Cave are pretty fantastic to go check out. So, Adrian was wondering if you could speak to the future of floodplain forests that were once inhabited by ash trees that will now be without that important tree.
I'm definitely not an expert on that. From what I've heard, so black ash are not really floodplain trees. They're more northern swamp trees where you have some standing water or some shallow wetlands. Floodplains are really, that area along a riverbank that gets flooded and periodically, and then the water recedes. And for those, a lot of that is silver maple and some green ash, cottonwoods. As you go south, it's river birch. But just the concept of black ash and what's going to happen. From what I've read from studies, there's no native tree that is an immediate swap out that's going to just do perfectly like black ash do in the vernal ponds and the swamps. They've looked at, tamarack and white cedar, and none of them are perfect. I guess swamp white oak tends to do pretty well right now. That's only found in southeast Minnesota. So we would need a warming climate for us to be able to plant swamp white oak in spots where black ash have been growing. I know there's a Manchurian ash that's not native to North America, it's native to Asia, that tends to do pretty well. But, that's a question of, do we bring over a tree species that's not native here, and add that into the landscape, and change it more from what's native? So I think the verdict's out on if there's going to be a great way to help replenish the black ash forests, and at the scale that we have ash trees, it's going to be really hard for us to just totally replant those, because we have millions of acres of ash trees in Minnesota.
There's hundreds of them just in my neighborhood. So
Yeah.
See them. Sarah was wondering, it's an interesting question. She has a young forest with aspen, birch, and buckthorn. As she's clearing out the invasives, do you have any suggestions on what to plant?
I would say be tenacious with the buckthorn. That would be number one, because there's going to be a seed bank in the soil that's going to keep coming up for years and years and years. So that's going to be important to, get rid of all the seed producing buckthorn. If you can, bag them up so the seeds aren't falling on the ground, get them away. Just being regular about pulling those out. And then in terms of what you could get established, if you got birch and aspen growing there, depending on how dense it is, you might be able to get some oaks or maples established. Maples are the most shade tolerant tree out there. So if you plant one and it's getting sun, it's not going to die. And if you plant it and it's shaded, it's going to do just fine. Oaks need a little bit more sunlight. But basswoods would be a good one. They're kind of semi-shade tolerant and they grow fast. So basswoods, hackberries, and I would say not just picking one thing, because the more diverse you put out there, you're not as susceptible to one making it or not. But you might want to reach out to your local DNR office, and they might have a forester that can come out and take a look at your property and give you some good recommendations.
Yeah, it's a great point. Looking to local either DNR or county people, foresters, city foresters. A lot of cities have foresters too that could help out with some good suggestions for that also.
And depending on what you plant, you might need to fence off those individual trees too. So I don't know if you're in northern Minnesota, if you're planting white pines, they're going to have to fence those off or the deer are going to eat them. Same with oak trees. So you want to make sure that whatever you're investing your time and money into, if they are highly desired by deer, you want to protect those until they get up above that 6-foot browse line.
Yeah. Leah had a question about how does soil depth affect succession? Think about how little soil we have on the North Shore.
definitely impacts what can grow there. There are some plants that have really deep tap roots. If you think about a bur oak or you think about your prairie grasses and forbs, they have, you know, 6 to 10 foot deep roots that they need. So even if the climate warms up to a point where it could be prairie, those things probably won't do well where you've got maybe 8-12 inches of soil since the last ice age on the North Shore. So you're going to have plants that have more shallow root systems. Your conifers in general have shallow root systems. They evolved in places with a lot of frost in the ground, so not putting their roots deep. You're going to likely also find other plants that have shallow root systems. Most trees might surprise people, but most trees, not like bur oaks, have about 90% of their root system in the first 3 feet. And then after that, there's some tendrils, but there's not much. And so, a lot of those trees can get established. They might not get to be as big as possible, but, if there's a foot or a foot and a half of soil, that'll just stunt their ability and how big they really can get.
Great. Sarah and Beth, I see Don, a bunch of other people in here say thank you very much for the presentation. They love the slides and the stories behind them. So again, Brian, thank you so much for joining us today. We're just about out of time. I wanted to remind everybody, visit our website, mndnr.gov/discover. Our spring programs start next week. Emilie Justen from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture is going to join us and talk about poison ivy and other noxious plants across the state. So that is up on our website now to register for that, and hopefully you guys can join us next week. Get outside, be safe out there. The ice is deteriorating fast with our warm weather, but get outside and enjoy the warm weather, and check out some books, look at the landscape, and see, put into practice, I guess, what you learned today. So thanks, Brian. Hope everybody has a safe week, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Benji.